Chapter 2 Infant Terrible Part 1 Tosh Synopsis. A child named Tosh tries to save a small Artopian town, while the entire story is about an older girl trying to save an Artopian city. Midrash number 1 The Bird's Nest. The greatest commandment that God gave us relating to how mankind interacts with mankind is, quote, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." Exodus 20, verse 12. This commandment is the fourth of the 10 commandments, and is considered the greatest among the last 6 commandments. The first 3 commandments supersede all the others, for they are how we interact with God. Only 2 commandments out of the 613 outlined in the Bible have the promise of a length of days added to their fulfillment. The greatest commandment leads to a length of days, but also so does the least. It is agreed upon in Talmud Jerusalem, Kedushin 20 verse 2, that the least commandment is, quote, "If you come across a bird's nest, you shall let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, that it may go well with you, and that you may live." Deuteronomy 22 verse 6 through 7. Something as insignificant as, "You shall let the mother go," can cause you to live a longer and blessed life. Letting the mother bird go hastens the coming of the King, Messiah, and the millennial reign. It is written, quote, "And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Isaiah 6 verse 8. The one that was sent was, symbolically, the mother bird. The mother bird is the Holy Spirit, and the baby birds symbolize Jesus at his death on the cross. Quote, reference, The Greatest and the Least by Jeremy Chance Springfield. End of Midrash number 1. Setting, year 2230 AD, the town of Neam. Tosh. Tosh lived in the cleft of a mountainside on the city's edge. She had gray fur, 2 feline pointed ears, and large pink eyes. Above her was a cliff where city residents would sometimes meet. Teenagers would gaze out at the shadowy forest, but they never wandered far past the street lights. It was lonely, but Tosh was satisfied living in her tunnel outside the city, as the city noises and flashing colors terrified her. Ever since the soldiers came and destroyed her home and the entire town of Edoron, sights and sounds just weren't the same anymore. She felt comfortable living on the edge where she could flee into the safety of the wilderness at any moment. A soft breeze emitted from the tunnel's mouth. She shivered and hung up another blanket to conceal the gaping darkness of the cave. Her home was just the first 10 feet of it. Anything beyond that she avoided. There was something terrifying about the chasm a mere millimeter on the other side of the veil. Sometimes she could smell the faint whiff of sulfur from it. The tunnel was a possible escape option if she was attacked, but that didn't make her feel better about it. She imagined the tunnels were as complicated to navigate as a tree's root system, where it was easy and likely to get lost. She was only 6 years old, but at her age she was already self-sufficient. Everyone was genetically modified to mature quickly, although no one else lived isolated and alone as she did. Tosh had always been a little different. She wasn't born as a baby like most Artopians. She was born at the age of 42 months, when a child typically builds their first memories. The first thing she remembered was falling over out of a birthing pod onto a soft, cold mat.
"Stand up. You can do it. You don't need anyone carrying you,"
said one of the scientists. She had not understood him, besides for the word stand. Shakily, she stood up on her hind feet. She had a vague recollection that she was human, although she was tempted to revert to all fours like an animal. She also knew that she was an Artopian, and this seemed to go hand in hand with being a human. Later, she would learn that a rudimentary knowledge of the world was downloaded into her before she was born. She was dressed in white leggings and top, and then placed into a padded cage. Beside her, on each side, were 2 more padded cages with a child in each. On the other side of the room were children too, or something that resembled them. The children on the other side of the room rarely spoke, and mostly growled or rocked back and forth in the corner of their cages with wide, confused eyes. She liked the 2 children on either side of her more, for they resembled her. One of them, a girl named Farah, would sing to her, and even tried teaching her a few words. But as the days passed, the scientists would take Farah away, and each time she returned, She resembled the creatures on the other side of the room more and more. The scientist took Tosh out of her cage too, but it wasn't to inject her with things as done to her friends.
Should she really have been kept in here? This is all top secret. I was just told they were taking her out to live in Artopia tomorrow.
It's been a week, and she hasn't learned more than a few words. She won't remember a thing, will you, lassie?
The scientist pitched her on the cheek and placed her back in the cage. It was true that she had not acquired the ability to understand language, but she remembered what the words sounded like, and that night, when they were gone, she repeated the words over and over.
Won't remember a thing, will you, lassie? Won't remember a ing, will you, lass? Won't remember a ing, lassie.
Farah reached out with a new elongated talon and nudged her. Remember, she said. Remember everything. Tosh grasped her friend's claw and fell asleep. The following day, she met her mother and father. After that first day, she never saw her father again, but went to live with her mother. All she remembered of her father was that he worked for the military. Life with her mother did not go well. There is something wrong with you. You are not my daughter. I don't know what you are. If I had not sent my daughter away, I would still have her, and your so-called father would never have left me all alone with something like you. Her mother, Sagita, began to say things like this the more she got to know Tosh. She told her the government stole her other daughter and replaced her with Tosh because they thought they could trick her. For a long time, she blamed Tosh for this and the entire empire of Artopia. In revenge, Sagita took herself and Tosh out of the mandatory conditioning treatments and moved them out of the empire to a small mountain town called Edoran. Withdrawal from the conditioning treatments was terrible for Tosh. She developed shakes, tremors, anxiety, and irrational thoughts. She lost most of her eyesight and hearing. Her mother said they were turning into monsters. But it was only after quitting the Artopian drugs that Tosh began remembering in better detail her first week of life, just as her friend had asked her to. She told her mother that it was the drugs and treatments that turned her friend into a monster, not their absence. She didn't want just to remember, she wanted to tell everyone, although she did not know how. You can show them by what you will become, her mother had said ominously. During the difficult withdrawal, the only thing that helped calm Tosh was sitting in their backyard and counting birds. Tosh recalled how she hadn't always been so dependent on conditioning. Her first week of life without it, she had been fine. Farah's singing was the clearest thing she could remember anything being. The withdrawal was more difficult for her mother than for her. It caused her to lash out at her more than ever. Her mother's words made her sad, but they also made her look at the birds in the wilderness differently than she had at first. Tosh would stop in her play sometimes and wander to the edge of the woods and watch it fill up with birds as she wondered where they had all come from and where'd they go when no one was looking. Back to heaven was the answer her mother gave her. Back to Eden. It's strange how dying can make you look at things differently. Having their eyesight go bad also made them look at things differently. When her father left, her mother began to read some of the confiscated books he took from the savages' towns. Her mom wanted to sympathize with the savages because they hated the government as much as she did. From the books, she found the Torah. According to her mother, the chemicals in her father's weapons caused her other daughter to be born with defects. Artopia took her away because she was broken. Sagita had turned to the savages' gods as an act of rebellion, as resistance against tyranny. In a tyrannical way, her mother wanted herself and Tosh to turn into monsters, the same creatures that Artopia fought against, so they could attack the empire in one last act of revenge. After a few weeks, to their surprise, the withdrawal symptoms began to lessen, and some of Tosh's eyesight and hearing returned. They were not turning into monsters after all. Tosh imagined how easy it would be for anyone who missed a day of conditioning just to assume they were turning into monsters when they began to have headaches and tremors. Some of the books her mother read described how Artopia used drugs to keep people addicted to the institution. Her mother found understanding in the books and taught Tosh from them daily. It was rare in Artopia for children to have any interaction with their parents. As a result of their time together, Tosh grew to love her mom. This was strange in Artopia, as most children hated their parents and wished to be left alone to play video games in the metaverse. Although not conditioning, her mother was still an Artopian, and therefore didn't know how to respond to such neediness and an unembarrassed affection. She assumed that taking them out of conditioning would turn them into monsters, but this didn't happen. True, she and her daughter became sick and lost much of their hair, but they did not lose their minds. Soon, there was no more energy to be angry. The resentment she felt towards Tosh dwindled, and she began to go outside to sit and watch the birds with her. Tosh missed those moments when they would watch the birds and talk of heaven. Heaven was where her mother said her other daughter was. Tosh looked up and watched for birds as the sun rose above the smog of atmospheric debris. Niam's glass towers lit up as they caught the glow of the sun. She looked past them at a single black silhouette flying in the sky. Somewhere, she reminded herself, behind the tall buildings and factories, high up in the sky, there is a place called heaven. The city people would laugh and mock her when she said things like this, but she would make them understand. She had no other choice. No one besides she survived the destruction of Edoran because the people were too scared to flee into the wilderness. They tried to hold up in their homes and bunkers instead. They were indoctrinated to fear the wilderness. But if she could just show them the proof that a safe place was waiting for them somewhere out there, then they would follow her. She didn't have much time. The soldiers and mutated shadow creatures had come again, and at any moment they would attack, and then it would be too late. The bird flew closer and landed on her arm. It looked up at her with blue-black eyes. All crows are born with sky-blue eyes, but this one was near adulthood. The crow cawed and dropped a tiny piece of amethyst in her lap.
Is this another piece of heaven you have brought down for me? Thank you, Jasper.
She named him Jasper, for he reflected colors like a smooth, dark stone.
You will certainly save them. You will keep the people of Niam safe,
she said to the bird. Tosh once assumed heaven was some mystical place she couldn't reach, but she learned that this wasn't true. Heaven was a very real place, and it was right above them, and if she tried hard enough, she could solicit God's help to save all the people of her town. The stones and the rainbow birds are proof of this. Just a few months before, the mayor of Niam ordered that all crows and doves be killed because they carried infectious diseases. During the purge, birds fell from the sky like stricken angels that were swept up in piles and burned. Jasper's egg was the only remnant left behind of them. Tosh knew that most children were made inside laboratories in Artopia, but as she kept Jasper's egg warm and made sure he hatched, she felt as if he was in a way her child. Just a few months before, the mayor of Niam ordered that all crows and doves be killed because they carried infectious diseases. During the purge, birds fell from the sky like stricken angels that were swept up in piles and burned. Jasper's egg was the only remnant left behind of them. Tosh knew that most children were made inside laboratories in Artopia, but as she kept Jasper's egg warm and made sure he hatched, she felt as if he was, in a way, her child. It made her happy to see him fly free, his feathers greedily catching the sunlight, making him look like the fiery rainbow birds in her dreams. Sometimes the light would hit Jasper's black feathers just right, and in the glossy sheen she'd see all the colors of the rainbow. Most of the other birds flew away to distant towns the moment the strange creatures gathered in the woods. But her crow always returned to her day after day, despite the danger. He would not abandon her or the town.
Listen very carefully, Jasper.
The bird tilted his head, bright-eyed and ready.
When you fly up to heaven, you must ask God to save our town. Ask him what I must do to warn the townspeople that we are in danger. The monsters and the shadow people will be coming soon. Perhaps if I can keep enough birds here in town, they will fly to heaven with you and ask God to spare this place.
She held the bird close as she tied the message onto his leg. Her mother hadn't exactly taught her the concept of praying, but Tosh understood the idea of carrier pigeons. She was confident that her crow would fly to God and tell him her message. The bird ruffled his feathers and emitted a strange garbled sound from his throat. She imagined he was trying to sing some song he had heard in paradise. But crows have such rough voices. Tosh had a sickly appearance, and tawny pale white patches of skin showed where her fur fell off. People thought she was diseased and delusional. Biochemical weapons that caused people to mutate destroyed Edoran, leaving her alone without family or friends. People were scared that she might spread diseases from Edoran to them. The townspeople tried to make her go through conditioning, but she refused. Tosh remembered what the Artopian pharmaceuticals did to her friend Farah, and she feared the terrible withdrawal symptoms. The first time Kitty felt a strong sense of sadness or anger was after being taken off the drugs, but ironically, she was happier being able to feel these emotions, as these were the emotions that led her to watch the birds in the first place. So, Tosh lived outside the village in her abandoned tunnel where people couldn't force her to do anything. They tolerated her and sometimes gave her rations. Still, they called her Tosh, which meant rubbish and nonsense. She didn't even think the townspeople knew her real name, which was Kitty, but she didn't mind. The pain that not conditioning caused her was like a bittersweet conviction that prodded her on. It gave her a kind of dignity, as it instilled in her a greater sense of self-knowledge. Her elements continually drew her attention towards the thing that mattered the most. There was a sense of urgency in her life, underscoring how transitory life and temporal bodies can be. Her life was not tragic, but full of astonishing depth, and sometimes she'd marvel at how deeply she felt. She could not see or hear well, but this counteracted sedation and enlivened her senses. Kitty was unmistakably alive. She kissed the little bird, and then not so gently tossed him into the air. With one call, the crow opened his wings wide and caught an updraft from below the cliff. Higher and higher he climbed up the ladder of wind. He circled once, cawing proudly, and then disappeared into the cloudy sky. Tosh waved goodbye, and then pushed the coals around in her bonfire. She checked under the lid to ensure the beans she stole from Miss Rodden's house were cooked. When she first started living in the wilderness, she planted dozens of potatoes in a secret hidden garden. After only 2 months, the potatoes turned into hundreds of pounds of potatoes. They were easy to grow, and didn't require any care the entire 2 months. Unfortunately, someone discovered her secret garden and destroyed it. Now she stole her food. If people didn't give her enough food, or if she thought the food was laced with something, she'd steal it instead. If she couldn't steal enough, then she would rummage around the trash containers for it. Tosh learned early on, and a long time ago, that if she was going to survive, then that was just what she needed to do, and she had no problem doing it. She mixed some of the coals with the beans and ate them up ravenously. She didn't like stealing food, but she knew that allowing herself to die would be the worst sin, according to Peacock Nefesh. After all, if she starved to death, who would warn the townspeople about the disappearing birds? Tosh heard stories of how, hundreds of years ago, children sometimes froze to death in the back alleys of great big cities, or starved, although warmth and food were just mere feet away in the homes of wealthy mid-class adults. What if one of the children took a brick and smashed one of their curtain-covered windows and entered in? Tosh wished she could give every child like that a brick before they succumbed to the elements. Maybe then the world would pay attention. The veil between the truth and the blind must be ripped top to bottom. If she conditioned, she wouldn't think such rebellious things. Although she was homeless, she was not helpless. She'd do anything it took to remain free and unmolested by the conditioning consenters. That was the only way she could keep Jasper, her little rainbow-colored bird. She'd never be able to bring him into the town with her. Old townspeople thought birds, especially big black birds like him, as dirty and unfit to allow to live. They couldn't see the beautiful rainbows hidden right underneath. She took the ashes from the fire and rubbed them into her forehead. She rubbed the rest into her fur till her entire face and body was dull gray, and all her orange fur was covered up. The ash was how she protected herself from the radiation without conditioning. She wanted to be strong for the town above. They might not know it yet, but she and Jasper were going to save them. She sensed something around the town, some insidious force. As she scanned the forest and fields for birds, she saw shadow figures moving, figures that were not supposed to be there. She tried to warn the townspeople about the shadow people, but they accused her of imagining them, as if she was crazy. But she knew. These shadows were the same figures she saw before the destruction of Edoron. The birds disappeared then as well, the day before it all happened. The only thing she had left from her old town was a ram's horn that her mother confiscated from her father's collection. Tosh blew it sometimes at night, far out in the field where no one but heaven could hear. No one ever answered her back, but someday soon they would. Tosh looked over herself one more time and caught a glimpse of an orange glow on the back of her shoulder. She rolled over in the ash and rubbed it in with sackcloth until she was ready.